Imagine escaping a brutal killer, only to find yourself trapped in a far worse nightmare. What if the darkness doesn't let you go? What if the true horror isn't death, but the endless cycle of terror that follows? Stay tuned as we dive into a chilling story of survival, fear, and a soul caught in the most terrifying trap imaginable. You won't believe how it all ends. Watch until the very end if you dare. The room was silent, eerily so. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting long shadows across the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and old furniture. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale colder than the last. It was almost too quiet. Then, a sudden noise. A creak from the far corner. Her body froze. She turned her head slowly, eyes darting across the room. Nothing. Just the shadows. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. But then it came again. A sound, faint but distinct, like something dragging across the floor. Her pulse quickened. She stood up, her feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Slowly, she approached the source of the noise, her hands trembling. The room seemed to close in around her. She felt trapped, unable to move quickly enough. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was stuck, frozen in place. The noise grew louder, more distinct. It was closer now. Right behind her. A cold breath brushed against her neck, sending chills down her spine. Her eyes widened in terror, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. And then she heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost inaudible. Her name. Sarah. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her mind raced. Her body screamed for her to flee. But before she could turn, something grabbed her shoulder. Cold fingers, like ice, gripped her tightly. She gasped, her body jerking in shock. Slowly, she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But no one was there. The room was empty. Silent once again. Her heart raced, her pulse like thunder in her ears. Had she imagined it? Had her mind played tricks on her? She glanced around, her eyes wild, desperate to find any sign of what had just happened. Then, on the wall opposite her, she saw it. A dark smear, like a stain. A shape. No. It was a message. Written in blood. You're next. Her stomach turned. The words seemed to blur before her eyes. Her hands trembled, unable to wipe away the creeping cold that spread through her body. The room felt like it was closing in, the air pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her legs felt weak, as if the very floor beneath her was starting to crumble. Her gaze stayed locked on the message, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Was it a prank? A cruel joke? But something deep inside told her it wasn't. Her eyes scanned the room once more, the shadows now feeling like they were alive, watching her. A sudden rush of fear surged through her veins. She turned, ready to run, but then a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Her body froze in terror. Someone or something was upstairs. Her instincts screamed for her to flee, but her legs refused to move. Her eyes darted toward the staircase, the dark passage leading up to the unknown. The sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, grew louder. Closer. Her breath hitched, each sound magnified in her ears. She stumbled backward, desperate to find any escape, but the walls felt like they were closing in, trapping her. The footsteps stopped. Silence. A pregnant pause. She held her breath. Then a voice. Low. Gravelly. Cold. You're not going anywhere. Her blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was real. The air felt charged now, crackling with tension. She knew she wasn't alone. Her legs moved on their own, panic overtaking her body. She had to run, had to get out. But as she turned to flee, the door slammed shut in front of her with a deafening bang. Her heart lurched in her chest. She was trapped. There was no way out. A shadow appeared in the doorway, its figure dark and menacing. It was him, the man who had been the center of the town's darkest stories. The killer everyone feared. The one who had taken so many lives without a trace. And now he was here, in front of her, smiling. The air was thick with the smell of decay and death. Her mind screamed for her to move, but her body wouldn't obey. He took a step closer, his eyes cold and empty. "You're just another name," he whispered. "Another victim." Then he raised his hand. The glint of metal reflected in the dim light. The cold steel gleamed in his hand, the knife reflecting the dim light from the flickering lamp. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt like lead, unable to move. Every instinct told her to scream, to run, to fight back. But the fear had paralyzed her. The man's smile widened, as though savoring her terror. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice low and taunting. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and deafening in her ears. The cold metal of the knife gleamed brighter as he raised it higher, the tip glinting dangerously. Her hands shook, and without thinking, she lunged forward, desperate to escape. But she was too slow. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with an iron grip. She gasped, the air leaving her lungs as he twisted her around. "Struggling won't help you now," he growled. The force of his grip was unbearable, his fingers digging into her skin. Her body screamed for her to break free, to fight, but the world felt like it was spinning. The air around her grew colder, the shadows darker. She could feel her strength slipping away, the weight of his presence suffocating her. He dragged her backward, closer to the darkness. The room seemed to fade into nothingness. Her thoughts were clouded, but one image remained clear in her mind. The bloodstained message on the wall. "You're next." A whisper, almost like an echo in her mind. And then she felt the sharp pain. The cold steel of the knife slashed across her side, a searing line of fire that burned deeper than anything she had ever felt. She gasped, a strangled cry escaping her lips as the blood began to pour. Her body crumpled in his grip, the strength draining from her with every passing second. The pain was unbearable, drowning her, her vision blurred, the world tilting and spinning. "Please," she gasped, the word barely leaving her lips. He chuckled darkly, pressing the blade deeper. Her heart thundered in her chest, her life slipping away, piece by piece. And in that final moment, a single thought pierced through the haze of pain. Would anyone ever know what happened here? Would anyone find her? The world around her went black. The darkness swallowed her whole. Everything went silent. There was no pain, no sound, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. For a brief, fleeting moment, Sarah thought she might be dead. But then, a sharp, grating noise broke through the silence. A scraping sound like metal on stone. Her eyes fluttered open. The dim light from the lamp barely illuminated the room. She was still on the floor, lying in a pool of her own blood. Her body ached, every movement sending waves of agony through her. But the most terrifying part? She wasn't alone. The shadowy figure loomed above her once again. The man. The killer. He was standing there, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness, watching her with that same sickening smile. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, cold and empty, as though he was savoring her suffering. "You should have stayed out of it," he whispered, his voice almost like a hiss. Sarah tried to move, but her body felt like it was encased in concrete. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The blood continued to pool around her, growing colder with each passing second. She felt trapped, not just in her body, but in this nightmare. The man crouched down next to her, his face inches from hers. "You'll be just like the others," he said, his voice low and mocking. "And when I'm done with you, no one will even remember your name." Tears burned in Sarah's eyes, but she couldn't move. She was too weak, too broken. The killer tilted his head, studying her with a sickening curiosity. "You're still alive. You're stronger than I thought," he muttered. "Maybe I'll have a little fun before you go." He reached down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was cold, like ice against her skin. Sarah's heart raced as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. There was no way out. No one would hear her. She was alone in this room with a man who had taken countless lives before hers. She had to act. But how? With every ounce of strength she could muster, she forced her hand to move, reaching for anything within her reach. Her fingers brushed against something cold. A shard of glass. She seized it with trembling hands, gripping it tightly. The man's smile grew wider as he saw what she had. "You think you can stop me with that?" he sneered. But Sarah didn't hesitate. With every ounce of her remaining strength, she thrust the shard upward, into his chest. The glass shard pierced his skin with a sickening crack, drawing a spray of dark blood. His eyes widened in shock, momentarily frozen as the pain hit him. He stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat. For a brief moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes, a flicker of fear. Then the moment passed. The killer gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the knife in his hand. "You little bitch," he growled, his voice low and deadly. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, where the blood flowed freely. But Sarah didn't wait to see what he would do next. Using what little strength she had left, she pushed herself up from the floor, ignoring the sharp pain that coursed through her body. She had to move. She had to get away. Her legs felt like jelly, but she managed to stand. She took a shaky step, then another. Her mind was racing, every instinct screaming for her to run. But her body, her wounded, blood-soaked body, was betraying her. The killer's raspy breathing echoed behind her as she limped toward the door, her vision blurred and dizzy. He was still coming. She could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. Every step felt like a reminder of how fragile her grip on life was. The door was so close. Just a few more steps. Her fingers grazed the doorknob. But before she could turn it, a hand shot out, grabbing her arm with crushing force. She screamed, her voice raw and desperate, but the grip was unyielding. With a brutal yank, he spun her around, slamming her back against the wall. The killer's breath was hot against her face, his eyes wide with rage. "You think you can escape me?" he snarled, his knife now raised high. He was too close. Too fast. In that moment, Sarah knew she was done for. But as the blade descended, a sudden burst of adrenaline surged through her. Her fingers reached for the shard of glass, still clutched in her hand. Without thinking, she drove it forward, aiming for his throat. The glass bit deep, and the killer gasped in shock. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and wild, as the blood gushed from his neck. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, the killer collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his hands clutching at the wound. Sarah stood there, breathing heavily, watching as he bled out before her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling from the effort. She had done it. She had survived. But at what cost? The room was still silent, save for the sound of his labored breathing as life slowly left his body. Sarah's mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. The man she had thought would end her life was dead. And yet, the horror of it all still lingered. The walls seemed to close in around her. The weight of the violence, the terror, the bloodshed, it was all too much. But she had made it out. For now. And as she stumbled toward the door, she realized something. She wasn't free. Not yet. Not until the truth came to light. Not until the rest of the world knew what had happened here. And that was a fight she still had to win. As Sarah stumbled into the hallway, her body protesting with every painful step, the weight of what she had just done started to sink in. The air outside the room felt colder, the silence more oppressive. Her heart was still racing, but now it wasn't just from the fear of the killer. It was from the aftermath. She glanced back, her breath catching in her throat. The body was still there, sprawled on the floor. Blood pooled around him, a crimson stain that would never wash away. She had fought for her life. She had won. But the image of the man, his lifeless eyes staring up at her, haunted her already. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat and blood from her forehead. Her pulse hammered in her ears, each beat reminding her of how close she had come to losing everything. The house felt different now, empty like a tomb. The walls seemed to watch her as she slowly made her way toward the front door. Each step felt like an eternity, as if the ground beneath her was shifting, pulling her back to the darkness she had just escaped. The door was locked. She fumbled with the handle, her fingers slipping from the cold metal. She could feel the panic rising again, the thought of being trapped gnawing at her. But she had to leave. She had to get out of there. With a final burst of energy, she managed to force the door open, stumbling out into the night air. The cool breeze hit her skin, sharp and biting. The world outside was quiet, as if nothing had happened. The streetlights flickered above her, casting an eerie glow over the empty road. But the horror was still fresh in her mind. She looked around, disoriented, unsure of where to go. There was no one out here, no one to help. She thought of the police. They would come. They would find the body. But she couldn't just wait. Not now. Her mind raced. She knew there was one person who could help, who could give her the answer she needed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that even out here, even now, she was still being watched. The darkness felt like it was closing in again, its claws reaching out, waiting for her to slip up. She had survived. But the nightmare was far from over. Every corner, every shadow, felt like it was hiding something more sinister. She had to keep moving. She had to find the truth. The cold air burned her lungs as she forced herself to keep moving. The night felt oppressive, like it was closing in on her. The street ahead was empty, no cars, no people. Only the distant hum of a city that had no idea what had just occurred in the house behind her. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The adrenaline was wearing off, and with it, the full weight of her situation was starting to crash down on her. Her legs trembled beneath her, the pain from her wounds beginning to seep through. Blood stained her clothes, her hands, and the concrete beneath her feet. Every step felt like it was dragging her closer to collapse. She looked around again, a sense of paranoia creeping into her thoughts. The streetlights flickered overhead, their dull yellow glow casting long, twisting shadows. It almost felt like the darkness itself was following her, creeping along with her every step. As she reached the corner, she paused. Her breath hitched. The street felt eerily quiet. A figure stood at the end of the block. A silhouette, just barely visible in the distance. For a moment, Sarah froze. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge her presence. But she could feel its eyes on her. Her heart skipped a beat, and panic flooded her chest. Who was it? Could it be someone else coming for her? Another threat? She took a step back, her body tensing, ready to flee. But something about the figure seemed familiar. She squinted, trying to make out the shape in the dim light. It couldn't be. She blinked, her heart racing as she tried to gather her thoughts. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the light caught its face. It was him, the killer, or at least someone who looked like him. No, it couldn't be. She had seen him die. She had watched the life drain from his eyes. But here he was standing before her, like some twisted mirage. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Not again, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The figure didn't speak, didn't move any closer. It just stood there, watching her. Her mind raced, her body frozen in place. Had she imagined the entire thing? Had the trauma, the blood, the fear, finally driven her mad? Or was he back? Somehow, impossibly, back from the dead? The silence between them stretched, unbearable. And then the figure spoke. Did you really think it would be that easy? Sarah's blood ran cold. The voice was low, gravelly, the same voice that had whispered in her ear earlier. It was him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, shadows stirred. More figures emerged from the darkness. Figures she hadn't noticed before. Figures she now knew all too well. The other victims. The ones he had taken. Their faces were hollow, their eyes vacant, like soulless shells. And now, they were coming for her. She had never been more terrified in her life. This nightmare was far from over. The figures moved closer, their footsteps soft but unmistakable in the stillness of the night. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, but she managed to keep herself upright, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation. Was this real? Or had the trauma twisted her perception of reality? The figures moved as one, like puppets with invisible strings. Each step they took was calculated, deliberate. And then, one of them spoke, a hollow voice that sent a chill through Sarah's very soul. You can't escape. Sarah's heart pounded, the words sinking into her chest like a weight too heavy to bear. The figure that spoke stepped forward, its face as empty as the others, dark eyes that stared straight through her. Her body screamed to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen, caught in the grip of terror. There was nowhere to hide. The silence between them was suffocating. I thought you were dead, she whispered, her voice shaking. The figure that had first appeared, what she had thought was the killer, only smiled. The smile was wide, almost too wide, stretching across the pale, lifeless face. And it was that smile that made Sarah realize the truth. These weren't the victims. These weren't the people he had killed. They were the ones who had never left. His victims hadn't died. Not really. They were all trapped, like ghosts in some twisted purgatory, bound to him, to this place. And now, Sarah was a part of it. Her stomach churned with the horrific realization. You're one of us now, the voice echoed from the shadows. It was the voice of every victim, of every tortured soul he had ever claimed. Her body shook with the realization, her pulse quickening in panic. She had thought she had won. But now, it seemed that victory was just an illusion. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and Sarah recoiled instinctively. But before she could move, something cold and tight wrapped around her wrist. The grip was unyielding, like iron. She screamed, the sound of her voice ripping through the still night, but no one came. No one would come. She was alone. The figures closed in on her, each of them with that same hollow, empty gaze. The air around her grew colder, her skin prickling as though the very shadows were pulling her in. The world around her blurred, fading into darkness. And as her breath became shallow, her strength waning with every passing second, she understood. The killer had never left. He had only waited. And now she was one of them. The cold grip around her wrist tightened, dragging her forward with an inescapable force. Her legs stumbled beneath her, every step feeling like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body refused to respond. The shadowy figures surrounding her moved with slow, calculated precision, like they were part of some ritual. Each one reached out, their fingers long and brittle, brushing against her skin with a chill that felt like death itself. She tried to pull away, her muscles straining, but it was futile. They were all around her now, their hollow eyes locked onto hers, their faces devoid of life, yet filled with something darker. Something ancient. The figure who had spoken to her, the one who looked like the killer, took another step forward, his grin wide and predatory. You thought you could escape, he whispered, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. But you were always meant to be a part of this. The words sank into her chest like lead, the weight of them suffocating her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she glanced around, desperate for any way out. But the figures were closing in, their hands reaching for her, pulling her back toward the darkness from which they had come. "Please no," she gasped, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong." The figure only smiled wider. "You were never meant to survive." With that, he took a step closer, the shadows around him deepening, stretching like dark tendrils. Suddenly, the grip on her wrist loosened, and she stumbled forward, feeling a brief flicker of hope surge through her. But it was short-lived. Before she could react, a sharp pain shot through her chest, like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. She gasped, her hands flying to her body, but there was nothing there, nothing she could see. The pain only intensified, spreading through her body like poison, crawling through her veins. It felt as though her very soul was being torn apart. The figure laughed, the sound hollow and echoing in the night. "You're one of us now," he repeated, his voice almost mocking. "You're trapped here, just like all the others." And in that moment, Sarah realized the true horror of her situation. This wasn't just about death. It was about something far worse. The killer hadn't just claimed her life. He had taken her soul. The pain in her chest intensified, and she could feel her body weakening, her vision blurring. The figures continued to close in on her, their hollow eyes never leaving her face. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps, but it wasn't enough to stop the inevitable. The darkness consumed her, pulling her deeper into its grip. And as everything faded into blackness, Sarah's final, tortured thought was simple. She was no longer alive. But she wasn't dead either. She was stuck, trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The darkness stretched on, suffocating and endless. Sarah's mind felt like it was drowning, lost in a sea of empty void. But she could still feel, still think. The pain had faded, but the horror remained. Her body, though still bound to this strange, empty place, no longer felt entirely her own. She wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Or was it days? It felt like an eternity. The shadows lingered around her, watching, waiting. Their cold eyes never left her. They were silent now, but their presence was unmistakable. The silence was unbearable, pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. She could still feel the remnants of her struggle, the memories of pain, of blood, of terror, lingering at the edge of her mind. But there was no escape, no way back. "You're here now," a voice echoed from the darkness. It wasn't the figure who had spoken before, but one of the others, hollow, distant, and unfeeling. Her head snapped in the direction of the voice, but there was nothing to see. Just shadows. "You're one of us," the voice continued, the words chilling in their simplicity. Sarah's heart raced again, the sense of dread flooding her system, but she couldn't run, couldn't even move. She felt powerless. Her breath caught in her throat tight, as if something invisible were constricting it. "Why?" she managed to whisper, though it barely seemed to matter. "Why did you do this?" The voice responded, softer now, almost sympathetic. "We didn't choose this. We didn't want it. But we were chosen." Suddenly, the figures closed in around her again, their cold fingers brushing against her skin like 1,000 icy needles. "We never asked for this fate, either," one of them said. "But now we are bound." To him. To this place. To the cycle. The truth began to unfold in front of her, slowly, horribly. This wasn't just about one killer. It wasn't about his violence. It was about something much darker. Something older. The killer had never been alone. He was the keeper of the curse. The one who dragged people into this in-between, where the living and the dead collided. They were all part of the same twisted cycle. Trapped. Forever. And now Sarah was too. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the sound wouldn't come. Her voice was swallowed by the void. The figures around her seemed to fade, their forms indistinguishable from the darkness, but their eyes remained. Always watching. Sarah understood now. She wasn't just a victim. She was a part of something far more horrific than she had ever imagined. Something that would never end. She had been claimed, like the others, bound to the nightmare, with no hope of release. A soul lost in a cycle of terror, forever. And in the emptiness, the shadows whispered their warning. You can never escape. The blackness deepened, closing in like a vice, and Sarah was consumed, lost in the endless void where nothing, no light, no hope, could reach her. Forever trapped. Forever haunted.